Happy Easter. It's a greeting you're going to hear all over the place today. But what if that whole tradition of Easter isn't quite what it seems? Today, we're going to dive into a perspective from one pastor that really challenges us to look beyond the holiday and, straight into the biblical text itself. And that's really the big question, isn't it? The source material we're looking at today asks something pretty provocative. Is this celebration we do every year actually rooted in Scripture, or has it kind of morphed into something else entirely? Let's unpack that. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with this Easter dilemma, then unpack the whole Easter versus Passover thing. We'll look at a pretty stark warning in the Bible about celebrating specific days. After that, we'll explore the alternative, what's called the Lord's Day, and what that really means for freedom and how we remember. So, yeah, while most of the world is doing its familiar Easter traditions, the pastor in our source material is basically saying, hey, hold on, let's take a closer look. He argues that our focus should be on what the Bible actually says, not just on the cultural traditions that have been handed down to us. Okay, so to really get his argument, we first have to pull apart two super important words. They often get used like they mean the same thing, but according to our source, they have totally different origins: Passover and Easter. So here's the key distinction he makes. On one hand, you've got Passover, the original biblical Jewish festival. But Easter, he argues, that term is tied to a completely different tradition, a Roman festival. He even points out that in some Bible translations, the word Passover was actually swapped out and replaced with Easter, and that's where a lot of the confusion really starts. Okay, so if the word Easter is maybe a bit shaky, what about the whole idea of celebrating one special day at all? Well, this is where things get really interesting because our source brings in the Apostle Paul, who apparently had some pretty serious concerns about people getting tangled up in rituals. And wow, this quote from Galatians really hits hard. This is the core of the theological argument. You can just feel Paul's fear here. He's worried that by getting caught up in observing special days, the very people he taught were sliding back into a kind of spiritual bondage, making the calendar more important than their actual faith. So the real point here isn't just about some ancient festivals. The pastor connects this directly to how we think today. The real trap, he says, is when we become slaves to the calendar, believing that certain days or years have some kind of special power. That's when our focus shifts from God to, well, to time itself. So if we're not supposed to be focusing on a single annual holiday, what's the alternative? Well, the pastor argues that the true focus for believers is something different. It's called the Lord's Day. Now, if you look at the timeline from the Gospels, this all starts to make a lot more sense. The crucifixion happens on the 14th day, right during Passover. He's in the tomb for 2 days. And then, on the 17th day, which the Bible specifically calls the first day of the week, the resurrection happens. And that day becomes a really big deal. And that brings us right to this definition. The term the Lord's Day, which you can find in the book of Revelation, is interpreted by the pastor as that exact day, the first day of the week, Sunday. So it's not a once-a-year thing, it's a weekly remembrance of the resurrection. Now, this shift in thinking from a once-a-year celebration to a weekly remembrance, it's not just about changing your schedule. According to the pastor, it's tied to this much deeper, much more powerful theme: the huge difference between being a slave to rituals and having real spiritual freedom. And this verse from the Gospel of John is pretty much the foundation for his whole point. The truth he's talking about is the reality of the resurrection. He's arguing that once you really truly grasp that truth, you are set free from the obligation to follow these rigid calendars and rituals. And that leads to this really powerful analogy he uses. Think about it. A slave is bound by rules, has to ask for permission for everything. But a son, as a member of the family, is just free. The pastor's point is that faith makes believers sons, and that means they're free from being slaves to dates on a calendar. Okay, so if the focus isn't on an annual Easter celebration, then what did the Bible actually tell believers to do to remember what Christ did? Well, according to this pastor, the answer is found in the act of communion. The pastor explains that communion is way, way more than just some simple ritual. It's this multi-layered thing. It's about remembering, it's about proclaiming your faith, it's about showing that the church is one body, and it's about forgiveness, all wrapped up in one act. And he makes this super important point here. The power isn't in the actual physical bread and wine. He's really clear that it's all about the shared understanding, that collective memory, and the spiritual truth behind those symbols that truly matters. And so that leaves us right here with a question that really sums up this whole perspective. The source material is challenging us to think about where true faith really lies. Is it in celebrating a specific day on the calendar once a year? Or is it in the constant living remembrance of the event that changed everything? Something to think about.